Thanks, Luke. You know a little bit more about me than I thought you would, but that's good. Okay, so yeah, I'm really excited to talk to you guys. This talk is really going to be kind of in some ways, the inverse of Megan's talk. So she at the end said it was like, oh, it's bullet point, bullet point, bullet point, but like no like big conclusion and summary. Mine's just going to have a big conclusion and summary and almost no bullet points. Like I'm just not going to tell you that much about any facts. I'm going to tell you about so one idea essentially. Okay, so the basic idea, here's the idea, is that sort of when you're thinking about theory of mind in interactive contexts, you should really be thinking about theory of mind differently than most people have been. And you should be thinking about it in terms of representing whether people do or don't know, or what they do or don't know, not in terms of their beliefs. So, and it's sort of a somewhat philosophy style. I'm going to try to walk you through what all of that means and unpack it. And I will talk about some actual data on the web. Okay, so if you start with like how people typically have studied theory of mind in interactive situations, works something like this. So there are two people, they're interacting in some way, they want to understand each other's minds. So maybe say this person decides they're going to have a model of this person. And then the way that this typically goes is, well, you can't just directly model that person. You have to understand that this person also understands this person. They have beliefs about that person. So if you want to have a good model, then you have to do this kind of recursive thing, which is where this person has a model, this person thinking about that person. And if you really want to do it like the proper way, you have to like continue the recursion on and on and on and on. Okay, so that's sort of typically the way we conceive of it. It's also really the way that people have modeled theory of mind, generally speaking. So this is just a little toy example of, I stole from someone's RSA paper. The basic idea here is if someone's making an utterance like my friend has glasses, and then there are three people and you're wondering which person they're referring to, the way that you make sense of that, you're able to make sense of that through the idea that they're referring to this guy, not this guy, which is the inference that a lot of people make, is you have to do this recursive thing. So basically what you do is you have this pragmatic listener here. That listener has a model of someone who's a pragmatic speaker, and they're modeling that speaker who also has a model of this literal listener. So the literal listener basically understands that glasses is true of, say, these two people, hat is just true of that one person. The speaker basically does something like saying glasses, understanding essentially that you're going to say, if you wanted to refer to this guy, it would have been better to say hat. So the fact that you said glasses suggests that you should really be referring to this guy, not that guy. That's the way it's typically modeled. It seems complicated a bit. It also seems, I think, much more complicated if you think about not just two people talking, but a bunch of people interacting. And if you think you have to do this recursive thing for every person, every pair of people, multiple pairs of people, it seems like, oh my God, like how are we ever succeeding at this incredibly complicated thing? So the thing that I'm going to try to argue is basically like I think this work is super cool. And anyone that does RSA stuff, I do RSA stuff, I think it's cool. I'm not just shitting on it, but I do think that there's a different and maybe perhaps better way to think about theory of mind, and we can try to take a slightly different approach. Okay, so is this actually a good way to model what we're doing in ordinary interactions? And I just want to point out, like, sort of to get your intuitions going, like, it's incredibly effortless often. Like, you guys are working in collaborative groups. If you're sitting around thinking about, what people understand in that situation, it seems like effortless. Like you're in this multiple interacting people. So there has to be some kind of efficient way that we're doing that. And we'll propose like one way to think about that. The other thing I wanted to just I thought I'd give you a little bit of I don't know how much you guys know about theory of mind, but I thought I'd give you a little bit of a history lesson for how we ended up getting to this place. So here's a brief history of false beliefs and how we got to the place where we are now. So the very first paper on theory of mind, you guys may or may not know, was this paper called Does the Chimpanzee Have a Theory of Mind? It was published in Behavioral and Brain Sciences in 1978 by Premack and Woodruff. What they did in that paper, does everyone know that paper? Okay, some people don't know. Okay, good. What they did in this paper, it was cool. They were like, they're primatologists. They were like, look, we want to show that this chimpanzee has a theory of mind. They were interested in this one named Sarah in this case. What they did was they showed Sarah these sort of cases where an experimenter was trying to solve some problem and different problems. In this case, the experimenter was trying to like get into a door. The chimpanzee knew that a key would be able to like help them achieve their goal. And what they showed was that Sarah could like look at an experimenter trying to solve some particular problem, and then could like pick out the solution to that problem. And so they were like, look, this is awesome. here's this chimpanzee, it's inferring the goal that the person has, is thinking about what they need to solve that goal and is like collaboratively helping them. Chimpanzees have a theory of mind. It was like this big deal. It's the first paper that was published in Behavioral and Brain Sciences. In Behavioral and Brain Sciences, if you guys don't know that journal, the way that it works is there's a target article, which is like a big article that makes some claim. And then like they send out that article before it's published to anyone who's interested, and everyone can make a comment on that paper. Then the authors of the original target article have to respond to that, to the responses and be like, okay, what do we think now that the whole field has kind of responded? In the responses to that original paper, 4 philosophers-ish decided that this was not good evidence that Sarah had, the chimpanzee had a theory of mind. You can think of these as the sort of 4 grumpy horsemen of theory of mind. These 3 are really philosophers. Zen and Volition is kind of a philosopher. And the challenge that basically all of them raised was that, look, this shouldn't count as theory of mind unless the animal recognizes the possibility of false states. And the problem was that, look, otherwise they might just be pointing out real facts or relations that they understand about the world. So if Sarah the chimpanzee just thinks like, look, I associate keys with locked doors or a person attempting to go to a door, that's all the representation is. That doesn't show you that they really have a theory of mind. If you really wanted to show they have a theory of mind, the right test is to do a false belief test, showing that they could represent someone's false beliefs, because necessarily that couldn't be relying on their own sort of primary representation of the world, right? We know for sure that would be a good test. That's sort of, the problem was the lock and key really do go together, so you don't need to know anything about it, of mind to really appreciate that fact. Okay, so that was one thing, which was kind of this methodological point, but I think it actually came and partly was inspired by a deeper philosophical point of sort of how people are thinking about theory of mind. That really started with Dennett. So Dennett's basic idea, this is like the moment of real philosophy in the talk, was that like what it is to have a mind is just to be something that you can make sense of by taking what's called the intentional stance. And the basic idea was you're the type of thing where I could make sense of your actions by assuming that you're rational and then positing certain beliefs and desires that are combined in a rational way. So Dennett was like, whether or not you have a mind, that's just a question of like how to best explain your behavior, essentially. That was a very philosophical point, but it really got picked up, I think, by a lot of psychologists in thinking that like the way to think about what we're doing when we're doing theory of mind is seeing an action and then assuming some kind of principle of rational action and belief formation, and then sort of attributing beliefs and desires to you that would make sense of your action. So that really became the way that people sort of thought about theory of mind. If you think about this system, it really only makes sense if you're just like composite any kind of belief to make sense of that person's action. So you should have this system for being able to think, here's the representations that person has. They should be kind of arbitrary. They shouldn't have to depend on anything that you do or don't know. And so they should allow you, if you have this system that's functioning well, you can make sense of other minds this way or rationalize their actions, you should definitely be able to represent false beliefs. So this was sort of the origin of theory of mind. This is the way that people were starting to think about it when psychologists picked up how do we study theory of mind in others. So if you think about, okay, so where did we get about 40 years later? Here's sort of a brief summary. If you think about what we know about theory of mind from the perspective of evolution, probably if you use a false belief test as sort of the standard test, only really humans have a theory of mind, a full capacity for theory of mind. There's not good evidence that non-human primates can do any false belief representation. If you think about theory of mind in human development, at least explicit false belief tests, which are the ones that seem to replicate best, you really probably only get a theory of mind capacity after 3 years, which have evidence showing that. And if you think about theory of mind in the human brain, basically this is work that was done at MIT and now it is done sort of widely. If you think about the networks that are involved, it's really something like this theory of mind network and RTBJ that Jay was just talking about. Yeah, Jeremy.
The theory of mind after 3 years, like why does language develop before 3 years? What do you use that for unless you're
right there?
I don't know if
yeah,
this is your area even. So yeah,
there are different ways to think. They're different. So I'm going to say theory of mind doesn't just develop after 3 years, and that we use language in a very theory of mind rich way long before 3 years. But I think the people that would say that would say, like, well, it's not necessary. You could be using language in a way that doesn't.
Like, is it just from you? Yeah.
Do you want to, is this on the same point? Or is this a separate
I
point?
guess like I was just gonna ask like the Rene Baierjan had like argued that it's earlier, theory of mind is earlier,
Yeah, so the
like 18 months or something.
right. So basically the status of this was that there was this super interesting explosion of work, maybe like 10 years ago-ish, started, what was it, like 2008 or something? With Kovacs and Rene Baierjan and people studying like sort of implicit theory of mind tests really early, so not explicit theory of mind tests. And they were like, look, we can find false belief evidence for like looking at like, looking time measures in infants for like false belief representation at like 18 months. Isn't that crazy? Like we're deeply social creatures. All of that can totally fail to replicate. No one can replicate any of that stuff. There was a whole journal. I mean, I'd say the field is like largely, we did a meta-analysis of this essentially. It was partly what I'm basing this on, but there was a special issue of a journal of experimental child psychology that was like trying to replicate these implicit tests. Universally, those implicit false belief tests do not replicate. No one has found consistent evidence for that. They couldn't be explained in some easier way. I mean, that's a little bit of an opinionated take, but that's not a crazy take. Like that's like a lot of people have sort of come to that conclusion at this point.
Wasn't it that there was some kind of bias with the experimenter that they showed had an effect? So like they were basically getting.
Yeah, I've done some of that work. It just depends on the paradigm. But yeah, sometimes it's an experimenter bias, sometimes it's the design of the study. Like basically, like there was something that more grabbed their attention at the end of it because some occluder had to fall at some point, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So, okay, so this is basically the picture of theory of mind we ended up with, given where we started in like 1978. Okay, so is that actually a good way to model what we're doing in ordinary interactions? Is this sort of right approach, thinking about this very belief-based approach, this very sort of rational action way of thinking about theory of mind? And I want to say no, and I think there's another way you can think about theory of mind and how theory of mind works that makes a lot more sense if you're thinking about sort of our ordinary sort of interactive communication. Okay, so the basic idea, this will be a little bit abstract, but I'll try to make it more and more concrete, is that really all you need to be able to do, if you want to like have a real capacity for theory of mind, is be able to track the mental states of others. So you guys, here's an assumption, you guys do in fact have minds, and I can like, I can try to like keep track of it, how those minds are working or what those minds represent about the world. And I need to understand in some sense that those are sort of separate from my own understanding. So you can do those things without having a capacity for representing false belief. That doesn't require a capacity for false belief. So here's like one way of thinking about it, which I found helpful, at least at one point, which is think about a map of the world. So this is kind of your primary representation of the world. Let's say you have a map of this room, and there can be various things in the rooms like trash and old boxes and a laptop, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, if you want to be slightly more formal about it, you could think about, at a very abstract level, you could think about the map as just a set of propositions of the things that you take to be the case about the world. So it doesn't have to be like spatially, right? These can be abstract facts. You can sort of translate between propositions and facts or maps. So you can think about now another agent's map or representation of the world in a similar way. Just the set of the propositions that they take to be the case, or the set of facts that they take to be the case about the world. Okay, so if you don't have a capacity of theory of mind at all, you can still kind of like do something like predicting what other people are going to do in a given situation if you just assume that they know what you know about the world. So for every fact that you know about the world, you assume that they know it, and that anything you think is not the case, they don't think is the case either. You could go kind of some way toward predicting what they're going to do. So let's say that you represent cookies as being on top of your dresser, right beside your puddle from the leaky roof. And then now if you know that Cookie Monster is coming along and you're trying to predict his actions, you might be pretty good at just predicting that Cookie Monster is going to go there. Okay, so that would be like a very basic thing, kind of way you could do prediction without any theory of mind at all. But you could also do a form of theory of mind. So that's not really going to be a theory of mind, but you can do a form of theory of mind without doing false beliefs. So you can track another's understanding of the world in a way that's not identical to your own, basically by thinking you could take a subset of your map and then think that the person has access to that thing. So you could say, take your map and then use your map essentially, and remove the cookies, and then think, well, if Cookie Monster if the Cookie Monster's map is one that doesn't know where it doesn't involve the cookies being in a certain location, I can predict that Cookie Monster won't go to the dresser to get the cookies. This would basically be a representation of ignorance. So I can successfully represent Cookie Monster as not knowing where the cookies are, I can successfully predict that he won't go to the dresser to look for the cookies immediately. And the way that I could do that is not, nothing false beliefy about this, but just sort of using my own map and then taking a subset of that map. Yes.
How is having two maps that are non-identical different from representing another person's false belief? Like, isn't that kind of like the definition of a false belief, that you have a counterfactual knowledge?
No, I'll explain this in a second about how they're different sort of formally, but the way to think about it would be, you don't even really have to have two maps to do this. You can have a single map, and then you can just use part of that map to do what Cookie Monster does. The key thing about false beliefs is you could never represent someone's false belief by taking just a part of your map. So suppose you wanted to represent Cookie Monster as falsely believing that there are cookies here. There's no way to take your map and take a subset of that map that you could then use to predict that Cookie Monster will look for the cookies here. That's inconsistent with your map. So it'd have to be a totally separate representation. This would require something like false belief. Does that essentially make sense? Yeah.
Are you assuming you want cookies and that Cookie Monster wants them? How do you explain this action?
Yeah, so everything I'm doing is only having to do with like a sort of factual representation of the world. I'm like ignoring all desires and goals, and that's someone else's problem. I'm going to work on a very small piece of the theory of my puzzle here. Yeah. Yeah.
If this is like helpful for anyone else, but there's like this cerebral.
Don't talk about my talk there.
My question, I don't know whether I'm asking like a very weird question, but like Sarah Brown Schmidt called something like this like a 1-bit representation. Is that kind of what you have in mind, where it's like you can have like presence or absence as like a binary thing, but not like a graded?
So I guess not really. So propositions will be 1 bit, but there are going to be a ton of them. And so in that sense, like you could think about it that way, but that's just basically the propositional way of thinking about it is like the most abstract mathematical way to think about it. But you could do it a bunch of different ways. So you could have a very graded way of trying to do this. The nice thing about having this 1-bit kind of propositional representation is it tells you when a map is inconsistent or not extremely clearly. And so that's nice because it's going to tell you when you have to have a separate representation for someone else, or when you can kind of use a shared representation or partially shared representation of the world to do theory of mind.
So it's like a delta.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So you can think about, Yes. Yeah, they're hierarchically. Yeah.
First you have to mark your other agents man, whether it's identical or it's not identical, so you will change your label or you reduce new map of others.
Right. So the idea is I'm walking around the world. I have a primary representation of the way I take the world to be. Like in this room, I take the world to involve like this thing. Right now, my proposal is I'm the kind of theory of mind for all of you, which is that I'm representing you guys as also knowing that there's this thing here. The way that I'm doing that is by basically using my primary representation and thinking we share that content. So I understand that there's a screen, and you guys also share this understanding that there's a screen here. So it's a single representation that will allow me to do that. I don't need this iterative, complex belief-like thing. In cases where I want to do some more sophisticated theory of mind, like you guys don't know what I have in this water bottle. So to do that, what I would have to do is think, I have my primary representation, which involves whatever happens to be in this water bottle that I know. But I could predict what you guys are going to do by thinking like, I'm going to use my primary representation, except for this particular information that's about what's inside the water bottle. That would still be a subset of my overall knowledge. If I told you guys there's water in this thing and that turns out to be false, then there is water in here, just then that would require me having a sort of separate representation because I need all the facts to sort of be able to hang together. So I would have to have a totally separate representation where you guys falsely believe that there's, I don't know, lemonade in there. Okay, let's keep going. Okay, the point of all of this, though, is that if you think about this difference between what's called factive theory of mind, which involves like sharing a representation or using a shared representation, and non-factive theory of mind, which is having this false belief thing, the difference is really in like the kind of content that's represented, whether or not you're sort of representing inconsistent content. So this map is inconsistent with that map, or it's not really a difference in terms of like whether or not you're doing theory of mind. You can do real theory of mind without ever being able to do false belief representation. That's essentially the idea. Okay. So the key point I want is what time should I stop?
Saturday.
Okay. The key point is that using this factive theory of mind way basically allows us to share a representation of the world and to do a bunch of interesting predictions that make theory of mind a much less complex to do. So this is a model there's a nice paper by Evan Wester and Jennifer Nager that was in Cognition a couple years ago that kind of thinks about this basic idea. Another group of people have been working on factive theory of mind in the context of conversation. And their basic point, you can see the sort of model that I was sketching here. There's one way to do it where you're kind of relying on your primary representation to represent that this person also knows that there's a cat on this chair. That looks still quite different than when you're doing this kind of decoupled iterative thing that would allow you to do false belief representation. Okay, so that's basically the big idea. What I wanted to like do in the however much time I have left, somewhere between like 10 and 88 slides. Okay. Yeah. I can do this part quick, I think. I want to basically try to argue that like there is in fact some bully pointy evidence for thinking that knowledge or factive representation is simpler. It's a simpler form of theory of mind. And I just want to try to quickly sketch, like, or provide some reason to think that's the case, or tell you about some of the reasons that I think that's the case. So one of the things that I did with a bunch of other people was try to think about, so if you look at all of the evidence from all the ways you've studied theory of mind, is there good reason for thinking that knowledge is sort of a more basic form of theory of mind than belief? So I started with this intuition, like, look, that iterative belief thing seems and falsely seem really complicated. When we're just walking around sort of representing people as knowing something or not knowing something, is that actually a simpler process than that complicated belief theory of mind thing? Okay, so cognitive science, basically, they have a bunch of different tools for studying like which representations are sort of basic or primary. Here are 4 ways that people have looked at this, generally speaking. So you can look at when in evolutionary history, in phylogeny, a process arises, with the basic idea being that like processes that arise earlier in phylogeny are going to be more basic, and ones that are evolved later could be built on those. So they're somehow going to be less basic processes. That's one way you could do it. You could also look at in ontogeny, so just when in the course of human development a process arises, with the sort of insight that like, look, it seems like simpler processes are online earlier than later processes. You could also look at the amount of sort of control or effort that a process takes and whether or not that could occur automatically. And you can also look at patient populations and then think about, how easily is this process disrupted? With the idea being that more complicated processes are often disrupted more easily because they have a bunch of different component parts that require them to work. Okay, so we can use, one of the things that I did in the review paper was say, if you look at all of the evidence from all of these different tools, what do they tell you comparatively about knowledge versus belief? So is knowledge a more basic representation, of the capacity to represent knowledge more basic than belief representation? I'm not going to go through the evidence really, but what I want to say is, like, if you guys are interested in this question, there's a paper in that same journal, Behavioral and Brain Sciences, which really walks through every single piece of evidence that we could think of. And the short answer is that knowledge arises, you can find non-human primates who can do knowledge and ignorance representations. They can even represent someone as knowing more than they know, in addition to someone knowing less than they know. You can find that young infants, so long before, the age of whatever, 3.5. So at 9 months, you can find that they can represent what other people do or don't know. You can find evidence that they seem to be sort of automatic and effortlessly representing what people do or don't know. Basically, I think you can get that intuition. Like if you guys are all sitting in this room and we're all looking at this screen, you sort of, in some sense, automatically represent that people know about this screen. You don't have to do some sort of effortful, controlled thing to figure out, wait, does everyone know about this screen or not? And you can also show in patient populations, like people with ASD, that knowledge representations tend not to be very disrupted. False belief representations do tend to be disrupted. So there's like there's a developmental delay for passing the false belief test in people with ASD. There's no developmental delay for passing knowledge tests. Okay, and then the last thing that I thought I do is actually to show you that I actually do sometimes do empirical stuff. Is I thought I'd tell you about one set of studies that we've done over a long time, just looking comparatively at knowledge versus belief in an experimental paradigm. So the way that this worked is we had a bunch of scenarios kind of like this, where there was just, you're reading about some person like Mira who's looking at the night sky with a telescope. And then she can either have true information about something. So she's looking at some dot, which she thinks is Neptune, and it is Neptune. She could be kind of ignorant of what that dot is in the sky. Sorry, Mark, for my bad astrology information. It's the same. And she could have false information about astronomy or astrology. Okay, and then so basically we had a bunch of cases where someone either had true information, false information, no information, and then they were answering questions about whether or not that person thinks something or knows something. So in the very first pass, we just wanted to know, is it easier, are you faster to decide what someone knows than to know what someone thinks correctly? So here's the kind of the pattern that you find overall. Basically what you find is that knowledge you're able to correctly answer questions about what someone knows faster than what someone thinks. We use thinks rather than believes here just because thinks is a much more frequent word. It's much closer to how often we use knows. We also replicated this basic pattern. We were worried something that was like specific to the English word knows versus the English word thinks. So we did it in French with the same kinds of words. That has some nice properties because French works slightly differently than English, but you find the same basic pattern, right? So faster representations are correct answers about knowledge than belief. You can show that it generalizes to a set of factive attitudes. So factive attitude words have they have this interesting property where you can't say that, so I can't say so-and-so knows something that I think is false. So if I say so-and-so knows something, there's this, you should be able to infer that I think that thing is true. So if I say, so-and-so knows that Trump just got arrested again, then you should infer that I also think Trump got arrested again. Thinks doesn't, if I say so-and-so thinks Trump got arrested again, that you shouldn't make an inference about what I know. So there's this interesting property, just linguistic property of these words. You can classify them as sort of factive ones that have that property or non-factive ones that don't. If you just don't use thinks and knows, but just generalize to the factive and non-factive class, you find the same pattern again. So the factive attitude answers are faster than the non-factive ones. You also find the same pattern in people with ASD as you find it in neurotypicals. And we also did a sort of version of this with by reanalyzing some fMRI data, looking at RTBJ in particular. And basically, we took data from this study where there was a time when it was a study on moral judgment, but essentially there was a time in that experiment where they presented like so-and-so knew something or so-and-so like thought something was the case. And we were just analyzing sort of overall bold signal in RTBJ during that time. And basically what you find is that representing knowledge or other factive attitudes takes less neural resources in RTBJ than representing, like, say, what someone thought at the time. There's another piece of evidence that is sort of like more effortless or easier. So all of these are supposed to be convergent lines of evidence for this general conclusion, which is the pitch for today, which is that, like, if you guys are interested in studying theory of mind in naturalistic interactive contexts, like, you should really be thinking about sort of knowledge representations or sort of the shared representations of the world, not this recursive, very complicated, false beliefy way of thinking about theory of mind. Okay, that's the pitch. Yes.
Great book. Thank you. Would you say that that is kind of like either or in a way, so that there's like knowledge theory of mind, or whether there is like another form of potentially something that involves certain things like belief when you have something like uncertainty, or when it's more, when you're not talking about beliefs as about the state of the environment, but more about like properties of another person, character traits. So like when you are going into this whole desires, preferences, part of the definition. Where it becomes like there is no factual truth. Do you think that there is something like that type of theory of mind or not?
It's a difficult question, and so so far I've taken the extreme view that those are really, you should really think about those as totally separate systems. Part of that evidence is just looking in like phylogeny, that there seem to be like creatures who can really do one thing and or at a time in human life where you can really do one thing and can't do the false beliefy type thing. Or there are ways to think about how representations of like uncertainty or things that you're not sure about could still be fact of theory of mind. So the way that you would do that is like, I take so say like in your water bottle there, like I don't know what's in that water bottle. But you do. And so now I could represent you as knowing what's there. So that's interesting. So how is that like a fact of theory? Like, how does that work? And the basic idea is like, well, I have my primary representation that there is something in that water bottle. There's some fact about that. I don't know what that is, it's not filled into my primary representation, but I still think you have access to that fact. So there are ways of doing this more like complicated form of fact of theory of mind that don't require the whole false belief ability. But you could still do these kinds of cases where you're uncertain about something, or there's some form of like probabilistic information. So far, what I've tried to argue, like in the past, I haven't found reason to think, I have to think there's like some gradient. I still want to think like those are just separate systems, partly because of this like inconsistency point that I was making earlier, where it really seems like you need a separate system to do inconsistent representations. Yes, Stefano.
This might be out there.
Sorry.
But grinded the code or done dynamic programming problems.
Wait, have I ever done dynamic programming problems?
I'm just curious if you ever grinded the code.
Wait, where is this going?
Assumption is that recursion is a complicated thing.
Yeah.
Because it requires
Yeah.
like a lot of time and space and memory.
Yeah.
But there's like a class of problem solving methods
Yeah.
in computer science that turn recursive problems into
Yeah.
iterative ones.
Yeah.
Where you just cache the intermediate steps.
Yeah.
Could it be the case that people are doing this kind of caching where they're like storing these intermediate processes and they could just retrieve it very quickly and effortlessly? And any further steps just require a little bit of time to do and then restore that. So you really do have like a map, like a hash map of what's going on. And then you don't need to do this crazy call stack that explodes every time you want to retrieve some fact about someone's beliefs.
Yeah, I mean, so are there more efficient ways of doing the recursive theory of mind thing than the way that I spelled it out sort of at the beginning? Like, yeah, probably. What's interesting about theory of mind is that it's like super flexible and we're able to do it really easily, even in cases that we haven't really encountered before. So what the challenge would be to figure out what that sort of dynamic caching system looks like that would allow us to do that. So it's totally possible. I mean, the recursive point is a little bit separate from the inconsistent representations false belief point. And so I think you could basically do that either way. What I felt like was nice about the knowledge representation was it sort of solved both problems at once. Yeah, Megan.
So I totally buy what you were saying, but I also
Yeah.
Do you think someone like the knowing word just signals to us that the
Yeah, so yeah, this is like, well, what if all we're good at is doing true belief representation, not false belief representation? There's these nice cases from philosophy called Gettier cases, where you would have a true belief, but you wouldn't have knowledge. So that there are kinds of cases where like, say like in your bag, like you put your wallet in there this morning, or you put, say, like a wallet in there this morning. And then like unbeknownst to you, like I actually stole your wallet and then replaced it with an identical looking wallet that's not your wallet. And so you have all these beliefs that are like about the wallet that's in your bag. In this case, they're true beliefs, but we wouldn't say that you know that there's a wallet in your bag. And typically in those cases, that's the intuition people have. So one thing we've done in a bunch of cases is those Gettier-like cases where you would say it's true that you have a true belief, but it's false that you have knowledge. What you can show is that like basically like non-human primates can't do true belief representation, but they could do knowledge representation in that same case. Or you can show that if you do Gettier-like cases with like response times, that people are actually much slower in those cases, even though it's still a true belief in some sense. So I've worried about that a bit, but I think there's enough reason to think that's probably not really what's going on. Yeah.
Do you think large language models?
You know, that New York Times article on this, did you read that? That New York, oh, you haven't, okay, well, okay, I won't tell that story then. That's a hard question because it really just depends on a lot of things about what you think it means to have a capacity or a representation. So do I think LLMs have a theory of mind like humans have a theory of mind? Like, no. I think there are tons of ways of showing that that's not the case. Do I think LLMs can produce text that will largely correspond to our theory of mind outputs in a bunch of normal looking cases? Yeah, totally. So I think that the answer to that question depends on a lot of other deeper and harder questions about like, what do you think it means to have a capacity or representation, what it is to be, what humans are in fact doing when we're doing these things. So maybe we can have a beer and talk about that, but I'm not gonna have a short answer. Yeah. Mark.
Really enjoyed this. And I like the approach of thinking about what percentage of what we're actually doing in social interactions is like this kind of like on the esoteric, like false belief thing versus like, well, most of the time we can just knowledge.
Yeah.
I wonder about pushing that farther and asking like, what percent of the time in actual interactions are we doing active theory of mind?
Yeah.
Like what percent of the time are we just getting away with the dissociative thing, like the key fitting with the door?
Yeah.
Is that enough to like achieve a lot of the things we do in everyday interactions?
Yeah. So it's possible, but one thing that's convinced or makes me think that we must be doing something that's a little bit more slightly complicated than that is like how effortless it is to reason about like who doesn't know something, like when we're all sitting in a room together, like even like just basic perspectival stuff, or like if you haven't been to the party where so-and-so said something, it seems pretty easy for me to think of, okay, I should tell Mark this because he wasn't there. That doesn't feel like doing something like super hard or complicated. So I suspect that at least that level of theory of mind is going on all the time. Could we sort of supplement it by just doing really even more basic sort of non-theory of mind? So stuff like, yeah, plausibly. There's this whole field or part of the field of theory of mind that basically says like, we're doing submentalizing, which is essentially those processes which allow us to like look like we're doing theory of mind, but even more cheaply. Yeah. Robert.
Yeah, I think that you've really compellingly like argued that this is like needs to be taken as like its own like ontological kind of position, or like a different kind of stage of theory of mind. And there's been a bunch of people that have argued for kind of like a whole kind of taxonomy of stages where it's like you can have like representations of goals, but not the content of the goal. You can have representations of like the absence or presence of something without whatever, like a representation of like the intentionality of it or something. And like, do you see there? So I feel like you've made a really good case that this like maybe is a privileged thing in that hierarchy where like this feels like a very natural level to like analyze like theory of mind at, but like without denying maybe the existence of other levels.
I think that's probably right, especially with like the stuff that I said I'm setting aside, like goals, desires, like attentional action stuff. I think that has its own hierarchy. It's like something I've been interested in. It's been less well studied, so it's been less easy to make traction on that, but I think that's totally right. I think this is probably just one piece of that kind of division. And like, yeah, non-human primates can definitely do goal representation. So like there has to be an easy system that allows for that as well. Yeah. But I mean, notice that those, sorry, no, maybe I'll stop with this. Okay. Okay. Yeah. We'll talk more about that. Yeah. Okay. Sorry.
I apologize if I missed this. I was thinking about some of the things that you said when you jumped into the empirical part of your presentation, but I really like this idea a lot, and I want to learn more about it. Could you give an example of how you designed studies to be able to like test these things?
To compare like knowledge versus belief representation. So a lot of them were essentially like, I show you some kind of interaction of people or someone interacting with you in some way where they either know something or like have a false belief or have a true belief about something that wouldn't be knowledge. And then I ask whether or not you could correctly predict their actions in that case. So that's how like a lot of the like comparative psychology stuff or developmental psychology stuff works. In cases where you're doing like the sort of adult work with like cognitive psychology, or for my work, you can do much more complicated things. So you can just like show them videos or tell them stories about like whatever you want. And then, but what you want to be able to do is like, no, in this case that we're interested in, the theory of mind inferences, are they ones where you could just get away with representing what someone does or doesn't know? Or does it require you to do something more complicated, like represent that they falsely believe something and then represent the like, they're representing me is not representing them as falsely believing this thing.
Yeah.
Okay, last question, then we'll stop.
Curious what you think the implications of this more factive theory of mind are, or what you would like for designing studies